Let me begin this second session again by thanking you for your discipline getting back here, and to welcome our second panel. On my right, Alexei Bogaturov. Their biographies are all in the agenda that you all have, but Alexei is the deputy rector of the premier diplomatic training school in the former Soviet Union and in Russia. It's called MGIMO, and he is a distinguished scholar, and I might also say a very wonderful friend. Next to is Jim Leach. Jim Leach was a representative from Iowa, southeast Iowa, for 30 years. Look at that! I even remembered, and an old friend of Dartmouth. Several people in here, when I mentioned the fact that Nancy Kranich on my left said, "I remember Jim Leach. We were in his house." He has not only opened his house, but he's opened his heart and his mind to the work of the Dartmouth Conference, and we are indeed grateful that he would take his time from his busy new position as the president of the National Endowment for the Humanities to join us on this panel to consider this important topic. Irina Zvagelskaya has been my friend and colleague since 1984, when she first came as a brilliant young 100% loyal Soviet scholar, deeply critical of everything about the United States, to a still wonderful friend and a still wonderful scholar with whom I enjoy working enormously. And we work very closely together in all of the Dartmouth work. On her left is Nancy. And I want to point out, she's not only a friend, she's also a professor at the same university as Alexei Bogaturov. She is also deputy director of the Institute for Security, Strategic and Political Studies, of which Vitaly Namkin is president. And she is a distinguished specialist, actually. Here's what I want to tell you about Irina. You may well know that relations between the Soviet Union and Russia and Israel were iffy, non-existent for many years. And one consequence of that was there was not one textbook in Russia, in Russian, on the history of Israel. Thanks to Irina Zvagelskaya, there is. She is the author, and I've read it. It's a wonderful book, of the first thorough analysis and history of Israel, and it's a book that anyone would find to be of the highest level of scholarship. So, Nancy Kranich is the former president of the American Library Association. She and I spent some very fine days together in Brooklyn, doing Bronx. No, Brooklyn it was. Yes, doing
Brooklyn and Queens.
Brooklyn and Queens. There we go. Doing forums on U.S.-Russia relations, and Nancy has worked very closely with us in the public deliberation for some years. So I think we have a very distinguished panel. What is the question that this panel is going to take up now? Remember, we have a cumulative agenda here. We have put on the table some perspectives, one view of how citizens think about the relationship, what their concerns are, what their hopes, what their aspirations are. Now we have to ask a question that is the next one. What conclusions can we draw? What perspectives can we envision for the creation of a public constituency for the U.S.-Russia relationship? Will citizens press our governments in the United States and in Russia toward closer collaboration? Or, as a colleague of mine asked me at the break, will they be easily torn apart by extremists on talk radio and the potential for collaboration torn asunder? That's the key question. And that's what we want to hear our panelists talk about. I've asked them each to make an opening statement of about 5 minutes in which they put on the table, here's my position, here are my 3 points. And if they have more than 3 points, I'll forgive them. But we want to make it, then we'll come back for discussion as we did in the second panel. Let's just go right down the panel and begin with Alexei.
Thank you very much. First of all, let me say it was really touching to see my old friends Blair Rubel and Gilbert Rosman, whom I have now very rare opportunities to see, because my visit to America are not that often occasion as it used to be. And I also, it's my pleasure to see the audience filled. So almost no vacant places, which symbolizes that still Russia and Russian-American relations is something which is able to arrest public opinion, which is encouraging and in a way refreshing. Let me start from 0 point. I remember that 3 only point, but 0 point would be the follow-up to the previous session. I think we strictly continue the line which is typical for our informal dialogue in the Dartmouth. We are working at added intellectual value. We are trying to find practical answers to new practical questions. The one was raised in the previous session was why Russian youngsters are too much anti-Western. Let us count how old they were when the Gaidar reform started. In a way, they are kids of Gaidar. We know successful kids of Gaidar. Mr. Chuba is a friend of mine. He's a wonderful, and he's rich, he's everything, he's powerful. And these guys were deprived, or at least they believe they were deprived, by the reform of everything. This is how they were brought in their schools and their families, first of all. So these guys now came to be teenagers. Some of them are nearing the age when they enter the university. Unlike France in the late 60s, where the potential for revolutionary whatever defined by Wallerstein, where students, our revolutionaries, are teenagers who are going to be students in 5 years to come, which is a serious domestic challenge. Again, about our perception of misperception of what is being done in Russia. We, in many cases, including me, we reproach Mr. Putin and Mr. Medvedev for being not enough liberals, while from economic point of view, from inside Russia, their economic policy, their social policy is being viewed as too much liberal, as liberal and extremistic. This is how the average people, average youngsters, they react. They give this emotional reply. They're undereducated, they're very poor, they feel injured and deprived, and this is how it works. Now I come to my first point. I think on how much we attained in the course of this half century. I guess I was 4 years old when the Dartmouth dialogue started. But even when I joined Dartmouth, that was like 10 years ago, you know, I came only for one session to support a friend of mine, Vitaly Naumkin. He said, "Guy, would you come? Just have a look." And I came to have a look, and I stayed for 10 years. So because that was the first time in my life, me being a scholar, that I felt that I can contribute something practical and do something good for my country and for international peace. That the issue we were discussing at that point at Dartmouth was Karabakh conflict. We were not very successful in settling it anyway, but at least I developed first time in my life the sense of belonging to someone who deals something good. You know, not only teaching students, which is good and pleasant, but something practical. So in terms of practical thing, you know, just look, we started 50 years ago from discussing survival, death or life. And now we come to discuss constituency. That means that now we're discussing internal problems, most painful internal problems, primarily of Russia, not of the United States anyway, but still, it is essential. shift. And when when I read something or hear somebody saying that there's something wrong between Russia and America, I said, depends on how you count, depends with what you compare. I still remember the old Soviet days, the agenda of those conferences and the agenda of present days conferences, in order to discuss political systems, in order to discuss such things as political system in Ukraine, in Belarus, in Kyrgyzstan, and of course in Russia. You need, to my understanding, you need, of course, informal dialogue, because we know how it works. When two ministers come and everybody makes statement, it is a statement. They, of course, at official negotiation, they present their attitudes, official positions, and they disagree. After they disagree, that's again position. What we do in our Dartmouth dialogue is slightly different way. I pronounce some sharp words about American foreign policy, then Jim Collins or Jack Matlock answer me something in the same challenging manner. Then we have a little drink of red wine, and we understand we need to stay and to continue. So, unlike ministers, we are a bit less responsible. We are responsible scholars. At the same time, we are able to find proper wording. For instance, in the previous 4 days that I have been working with the guys, Russian and American guys at that conference, I understood some things about my own wording. I found out that some words I use are perceived by Americans as something challenging and insulting, why I had no intention to do so. And similar things vice versa. When I listen how they describe events in Russia, well, sometimes I feel so hard, so injured. And then I understand, no, guys, they did not mean it, and if you see how changed the wording of Russian media about America, America foreign policy, about President Obama, you will see that words do matter. And to teach ourselves, to teach our people, our audience, my students and your students, well, to use proper words is, from practical point of view, of immense importance. My second point is, our shortcoming as a dialogue was we never invited media people as intellectual persons. We normally invited them just to cover what we are doing, just technical things, people from business, that's it. Media is a business. At the same time, media is public, but much depends on how they feel, those people we invite or not invite in our dialogues. We need to involve them, because the way they use words, well, sometimes is terrifying, both in Russia and America. Sometimes I just teach my students, guys, these are wrong words. You wanted to say quite different thing. When you criticize America, you are just lacking proper wording. Please make notes. Please learn new words. So, sorry to say it, we need to invite Russian and American people from media just to participate in our dialogue and say, guys, there are some red lines which probably should not be crossed, at least at this stage. We cannot forbid anything official. Informal dialogue is the only possibility to persuade them to establish these red lines for themselves. For instance, I remember a very old French film which was started with the words, the Satan sent his servants to the earth to deprive people of hope. I remember myself, I was impressed, to deprive a man of hope, to make him hopeless. That was Satan's idea. When I read or listen some ugly things about Russian authoritarianism, lack of democracy, or even absence of democracy in Russia, I sometimes feel probably people who say and write have good intentions. They want to encourage Russians to fight against authoritarianism. But from practical point of view, from my students, whom I have been observing for 25 years, I know that if they lose the hope that it would be better in Russia, there would be more democracy, more freedom, more whatever possibilities to make career and conduct a normal life, they would leave Russia and they will all come here, and I guess you maybe had enough chances to get tired of those crowds of people, undereducated, who come here, and some of them claim to study Russia because they can speak Russian and read Russian, which is probably a little bit irrelevant paradigm of recruiting Russia experts in America. Sorry for saying it. So this is not to say we should not say unpleasant, true words to each other. Yes, we should. We cannot live without that. But we need to know where to stop, how much sharp words is enough, how much sharp words may be counterproductive from practical point of view. Just imagine my kids, my students in my university. It was just horrifying. They invented a game. They decided to make a students' game, which was called "Imagine There Is No America in the World." Can you imagine? I know why. Because there is a TV channel which constantly develops the same idea. America is going to crash. So America, with its interracial problems, black Americans, white Americans, and Latino, whatever, it cannot survive for too long. They say America is the Soviet Union today. So the fate would be the same. And kids, if not properly, trained, educated, if not explained, if not provided a proper wording, they may take it seriously. And this is why they're starting to use this game. Just we need to develop a sense of responsibility for what we are saying and what is being said in our media. So I would also say that this is a remarkable moment. I don't remember any time in my life, I'm 56, that there was such a favorable, friendly interest to the United States. Maybe because of the contrast of the previous 10 years, Mr. Bush, twice, he made tight everybody, but together with Mrs. Rice. Anyway, what is unusual, that Russians started to treat Obama in a quite different way as they did before, as they treated before any American presidents, including Bill Clinton, by the way. Even, the gentleman Alexei Pushkov, that his weekly show considered to be anti-Western, considered to be anti-American. Look how he changed the meaning, the substance of his criticism. Now when he criticizes America, he actually does not criticize America, he is criticizing President Medvedev. But in order to catch this nuance, you should be very concentrated on what is the substance, what is the context. Context is essential. And frankly speaking, to catch such nuances, probably we need high-level Americans experts on Russia. I'm continuing the old topic. I'm afraid my time is over. Probably the last point would refer again to Obama. Why Russians are so sympathetic with Obama? Because he made this impression of a very tolerant man. And Russians tend to believe that he is tolerant because this is his personal nature. Not being white, he must be tolerant. And this is not that he pretends tolerant. This is the substance of his personality. This is why he is being admired. But what is the problem? Where is the problem? Final words, is that he is not considered a typical American. A typical American politicians of highest level. That's it. Thank you very much.
I hear, just to draw out some themes in 10 seconds, that what Alexei has drawn our attention to is the critical importance of the images that we bring to mind as we talk about each other's country, and how those can trigger either negative senses or insults to our sense of our own identity, or of that of the other side. And by implication, he's saying how by changing those images, how we can have a powerful impact on creating a much greater readiness, I think, for interaction and a much more supportive public. But, Jim, will the American citizens press their government for closer collaboration? Are we ready, or are we headed for illusions? They automatically come on.
Fair enough. Well, first, as head of currently an institution dedicated to the humanities and academia, I'd like to framework a response with a reference to an academic paradigm that everybody in this room is well aware of, and then tie it to the vicissitudes of American politics. And the paradigms, actually two, that stand out. One is the Huntington thesis about contrast of cultures, and the other Joe Nye's reference to soft diplomacy. And I raise both of these, and all of you know the subtleties of each, but from this perspective. Both imply the centrality of culture and therefore of peoples, rather than government and policies, and both are rooted in the assumption that government is a part of culture, not the other way around. Secondly, democracy, and we have an evolved and a evolving, and it's not all clear that every aspect of the evolving is an improvement, democracy, and Russia, somewhat newer and also evolving democracy. It's not clear that any form of government is immune from making mistakes, although it appears from experience that democracies are a little better at holding government accountable and shifting gears when mistakes are made. And I raise this because in the last decade, the American people have concluded that the United States government and some of the best in the private sector have erred. And so they are seeking today some accountability, and whether they're seeking it in exactly the right way that a liberal might want is another matter, and whether they're seeking it in exactly the right way a traditional conservative might want is another matter, but they're definitely seeking it. And it appears that the American public on U.S.-Russian relations, and perhaps relations with many other parties in the world, has assimilated the Huntington and Nye conceptualizations without knowing of the conceptualizations better than government officials, all of whom know of the conceptualizations. And I raise that because that appears to be what the groups that Dartmouth has interviewed in both sides of our oceans, actually both oceans. And for instance, in America, in recent years, we had a governance that was rooted in the assumption that internationalism was soft-headed, and a foreign policy was articulated, part of which got very little public attention. But one, it was against the notion of expanding the rule of law in the security arena, that is, against a CTB, against improving the Biological Weapons Convention, and against some aspects of the START process. Well, where then, in a broad sense, is the American people? And here, a very interesting phenomenon has been extremely consistent since the Eisenhower era. And I want to go back not simply on these recent reviews, but the American people, since Eisenhower, have supported nuclear arms control and nuclear restraint. In fact, one of the great surprises of the Kennedy administration was the partial test ban was negotiated, proved to be extremely popular. They didn't know it. And frankly, the fact that they didn't know it might well have been a true tragedy, because there was this enormous opportunity in 1962 and 3 to negotiate a comprehensive test ban, and instead they settled for a partial test ban, which was more of an environmental than an arms control treaty, and may have held off the test ban itself. The American people also, at all times, have vastly preferred working in alliances. This isn't a new phenomenon just found out in recent polling. We always have. And so, among other things, it leaves some of the decision-making of the last decade of so-called realists standing alone is articulating not only feelings that are out of step with the American people, but arguably are profoundly unrealistic. And so sometimes in politics you have these battles for words. I'm a realist, that means I'm tough. Well, is tough realistic? Not necessarily the case. And so you have a real profound dilemma where at this time at least the American people seem to be well aware of the head of the American public. Now with regard to the Russian relationship, what has always struck me is that when times were the most trying in both of our countries' history, because in the greatest war in history, which was World War II, the greatest alliance in the history of man was the Anglo-American-Russian alliance. And we in the United States, to our fault, as a people have not recognized the centrality of the Russian sacrifice. We're very proud, and rightfully so, of the GI who trekked from Omaha Beach to the Elbe, just as the Russians are extremely proud of the men and women who defended Leningrad against arguably one of the greatest aggressive, maybe the greatest aggressive force again in history, or at least modern history in this case. And the sacrifices the Russian people are a shared sacrifice, although we all have to acknowledge the 20 million dead is a pretty awesome circumstance to honor. The reason I say this is that we're more intertwined with the Cold War than we are the Hot War in terms of our attitudes towards Russia. At the same time, we recognize that the Cold War is, with regard to the Soviet Union, dead, and that the new Russia is a new circumstance. We as a society are obviously somewhat concerned that corruptionism has replaced communism. By the same token, when we look at our own society, we've got some problems too. And in one sense, there is an analogy, although one hesitates to make it very close, but in America, we are sociologically becoming more unequal as a people. And part of this relates to the fact that we have virtually no corruption in American politics, but we have an enormous amount of conflicts of interest, and it appears that those conflicts of interest are increasing rather than decreasing, and this is something that we as a society are going to have to look at internally. But if we look at commonalities, and I think this is the most important way to look at the Russian-American relationship, we have a common sizable country. We have surprisingly few historically rooted conflicts in terms of both rivalries as well as in terms of vested interest. And this lack of natural antagonism is exceptionally important. And in fact, when we think of antagonism, it almost exclusively spurs from government rather than from the people. And this is of mighty significance if one thinks that it's people that matter. We also have common concerns. And here it appears that the Russians are less concerned about the differences we had in the Cold War than they are with the differences that have emerged in American attitudes in other parts of the world since the Cold War. And to me, that is exceptionally relevant to our concerns in the world. I would also say we have common challenges, and they're simple to understand. And the one that I use in almost every speech I give and almost every subject relates to the greatest burden of all, and that is the quote that I think is the most profound in political science in the last century, and that comes from Einstein when he said that splitting the atom had changed everything except our way of thinking. And so one of the great challenges for all societies, but led by the United States and Russia, has to be to deal with the split atom. And then the great surprise of the last decade for us, although not quite as big a surprise for Russia, but it is basically still remains awkward for all of our peoples and all of our leaderships to deal with is the power of a few to do bad. We've thought of the power of the huge instruments, but when we think of 9/11 and the absolute extraordinarily small number of people involved, it's a really unbelievable thought. We had a very wise woman who once commented that we underestimate the power of a few to do good. Well, we've clearly underestimated the power of a few also to do evil or bad, however one wants to describe it. And that is a common challenge for all of us. I would like to conclude just with coming back to Einstein and his notion that human nature is a stubborn constant in a world of what appears to be accelerating change. And that is, just as there is a human nature, there might well be a governmental nature. This may vary with the form of government, but it also may apply to circumstances, whatever governance model may exist. So if one assumes that culture is larger and more consequential than government itself, it follows that no relationship between societies can be sustaining unless there's mutual respect between people. And this mutual respect is likely to be affected deeply and perhaps led by ordinary citizens and by those who advance culture and the arts and humanities. And here, let me just note that in the 19th century, our great poet of the common man, Walt Whitman, once wrote an introduction for a book of poems of his that was to be translated into Russian. What in effect was a letter to the Russian people in a very odd way, but very intriguingly, he said that his great dream was that you'd have an internationalization of poems and poetry and poets that would be far greater in their effect than all the diplomats and treaties of the world. And similarly, Dostoevsky at a famous inauguration of a Pushkin memorial once suggested that beauty would save the world. And these are truly naive conceptualizations in one sense, but in another, the power of the word, the power of culture is rather extraordinary. And I think people underestimate it, and that one of the great hopes, not only for Russian-American relations, but for all peoples of the world, is that at a people level, when you look at recent polling, when you look at desires of publics in our two societies, the publics want to have better relations. And that is a basis for going forth, which is far greater than the reverse, and that one can visualize two governments having excellent relations, and if the people don't, the long-term prospects for the world are less than happy, and so it's good it's the other way around. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jim. I hear a very powerful common theme here, that it is the power of the word, the way in which those words are chosen, the way in which they are expressed, the way in which we relate our cultures to each other, the way in which we draw on the common interests that we have and the strengths that each culture brings will be far more determining than the actions of either of our governments in terms of our potential and capacity. But I hear you concluding that we are ready for deeper cooperation, that the basis is there. Irina, give us your view.
Спасибо. Я бы хотела начать не все-таки с российского общества, как оно сейчас может реагировать на перспективы восстановления, укрепления американо-российских отношений, а я все-таки бы хотела начать с другого опыта, который мы все разделили в рамках Дартмутской конференции, в рамках группы по региональным конфликтам. Я хочу сказать о том, что там и американские, и российские участники столкнулись с травмированным обществом, с обществом, которое оказалось фрагментированным, которое оказалось жертвой страшного гражданского противостояния, и которое, тем не менее, нашло в себе силы выработать некие рекомендации, выработать некие общие направления, которые, на мой взгляд, оказались полезными для правительства и для оппозиции, и помогли им тоже прийти к некому компромиссу. Вот если мы говорим об этом опыте, то здесь я бы хотела подчеркнуть одну, на мой взгляд, очень важную вещь. Наверное, этого бы межтаджикского диалога не было бы, если бы не то терпение, сострадание, приверженность делу, желание достичь цели, которые демонстрировали все американские и российские участники, но прежде всего Гарольд Сондерс. Вот в этот день 50-летия Дартмута я хочу об этом сказать. И для нас, для всех это было очень большой школой. Потому что если мы говорим об обществах, если мы говорим о том, что мы хотим, чтобы общества наших стран действовали вместе на таком направлении, как улучшение отношений между нашими странами, мы именно так к этим обществам и должны относиться. Мы должны понимать их слабые стороны, мы должны понимать их проблемы, мы должны сострадать им, и мы должны терпеть то, что нам не нравится. Я говорю о нашей группе по региональным конфликтам прежде всего потому, что она не только показала, что даже традиционное общество способно играть очень большую политическую роль и, может быть, пойти дальше, чем способно пойти правительство. Но одновременно это продемонстрировало возможность очень успешных действий в рамках американской и российской общественности. Мне кажется, что этот урок ничуть не менее важен, чем просто констатация того факта, что нам удалось что-то сделать в Таджикистане, что мы внесли свой вклад в урегулирование. И когда мне приходится рассказывать студентам о Центральной Азии, в частности, о вот этом опыте межтаджикского диалога, я всегда обращаю внимание на то, что их интересует не только, что собой представляло таджикское общество того времени, но их интересует механизм, с помощью которого можно возродить такие творческие начала даже в самом травмированном обществе. И вот это механизм, как раз предложенный Дартмутом, это механизм устойчивого диалога. Мне кажется, что он должен, может быть, действовать и более широко, с учетом большего участия наших обществ такого рода диалога, российского общества, американского общества. Но при этом я еще раз хочу подчеркнуть, мы должны понимать, что мы сталкиваемся с некими очень объективными ограничителями. И эти объективные ограничители для России, например, на мой взгляд, состоят в том сейчас, что поскольку у нас процесс создания нации далеко не закончен, мы неизбежно имеем дело с национализмом, который укрепляется на определенных этапах, который может иметь крайне отвратительные формы, но одновременно, к сожалению, так устроен мир, что без национализма не возникает нации. А пока российское общество остается очень фрагментированным, в том числе в культурном отношении, оно не может претендовать на то, чтобы занять достойное место в постиндустриальном мире, в современном модернизированном в этом смысле мире. Мы должны пройти определенный путь. И я лично считаю, что, так сказать, этот путь можно пройти только с помощью тех наций, которые его уже прошли, которые знают все препятствия на этом пути, которые понимают, почему это происходит так тяжело. И еще один момент, который тоже, на мой взгляд, очень важен, это понимание того, что российское общество, в том числе и молодежь, о чем здесь говорил Алексей, это травмированное общество. Оно все еще, как когда-то таджикское, остается травмированным. И это связано со многими причинами. Это связано и с тем, что, в общем-то, на Северном Кавказе до сих пор идут военные действия. То есть нет безопасности для всех. Это связано с тем, что у нас некоторые регионы очень бедные, и люди живут там совсем не так, как они живут в крупных городах. Это связано, я считаю, с проблемами образования. У нас ведутся все время реформы образования. Я не хочу показаться консерватором, но мне иногда хочется сказать, да не трогайте вы образование. У нас было не такое плохое образование. После того, как оно было деидеологизировано фактически, ну, и пусть бы они учились так, как они привыкли учиться, это давало очень большую отдачу. А когда идут постоянные, так сказать, смены курса, то, в общем-то, нечего удивляться, что студенты тоже дезориентированы, что они не всегда понимают вообще, что мы им пытаемся объяснить. Им не хватает культурного такого бэкграунда. Это очень важно, потому что в конечном итоге, если мы говорим о гражданах, если мы говорим об обществе, та часть общества, которая является более интеллектуальной, та часть общества, которая является более образованной, она несет огромную ответственность перед той частью общества, которой не удалось достичь таких же результатов, не удалось приобщиться к вот этой широкой не только национальной, но и интернациональной культуре. И здесь я вижу огромную роль Дартмута и для России, и для Соединенных Штатов. Спасибо.
Thank you very much. Once again, we hear the importance of sensitivity to culture, the critical importance of terpenia, patience, willingness to recognize the struggles that the other side has, and on each side, and that can bring us through, and the critical importance of education, of more internationalist perspectives. Nancy? No, you don't have to touch it. It's all automatic.
Okay. So I'm delighted to be back with some of the people that I was in dialogue with in 2003. I want to say how much I learned from being part of the dialogue with the U.S.-Russia Dartmouth conferences. So it's a great privilege to be up here with such a distinguished panel as
You
well.
may want to take your earphones off. You're getting feedback
Okay.
into the
Sorry.
microphone.
So I'm at Rutgers University, and we held the first test forum for this dialogue. And I will tell you, it was hard to get people to say the R word. Now, in Jersey, we think of the R word as Rutgers, but the R word being Russia, it was very hard for us to get them to focus on that particular issue, which is one of the challenges we face. But on the other hand, when we think of culture, I mean, we went to a Kandinsky exhibit last year in New York that you couldn't get into. And we have Russian culture all around us. At Rutgers, we have a wonderful 20th century Russian art collection. When we play music, it's Russian music. All around us, the literature of Russia, all around us is the culture of Russia. So it's not really hard to get the attention of the American public when we start with culture, because culture really brings us together. It's when your dancers are in the US or your opera or whatever as we really get a buzz. So there's a lot of excitement about Russian culture in this country. And so to me, what's really important is these people-to-people relationships, which we've talked about before, but how do we find opportunities to engage people? In some ways, we have opportunities like we've never had before. When my grandparents came from Russia, they left Russia. They never communicated again. But today's emigre, of which we have many in this country, they all stay in touch with Russia because of all of our telecommunications and new media capabilities. So we are connected in more ways than we think. And I think when we talk about resetting the relationship, part of that can really start with young people. Now, we heard that young people in Russia may be less open to that. I'm not sure they're less open from what some of the young Russians here told me last night. But I think that we have great opportunities in this country to rekindle relationships and reset them through the power not only of culture, but the power of our cultural institutions. So I will start off by saying that I was delighted to see that many of the forums taking place both in Russia and the United States took place in libraries. And being a librarian, of course, it's great for me to say this is wonderful. But we're talking about cultural institutions that seem neutral enough to people to be welcoming to varieties of ideas. And clearly we need that opportunity. So we have institutions in this country that certainly can promote that. When we focus on young people, we can also focus on education. Now, I just talked to my cousin whose daughter is in college, and where did she spend the summer? She spent the summer in St. Petersburg. And what is she taking for her language? Russian. She's very interested in political science and history, and it was really encouraging for me to hear that young people would take Russian and be interested in actually, these are Americans studying abroad in Russia, not just in Paris or in London. And then, being a good librarian, I went and did some research and found that, indeed, in just the last 2 years, there's been an increase in interest in studying Russian. In fact, Russian is so popular now at some colleges and universities that they're having trouble getting enough professors to teach. So why are students showing interest in Russian? Well, this is what one article says. Students view Moscow as glittering and exciting, and they want to be there as young people. It also talked about how the U.S. government has called Russian a critical language, which makes them more interested. But they're looking at it for more practical reasons as well. One said, my hockey coach is Russian. Another said, my neighbors are Russian. We have Russians in our high school. We play Russian video games. So indeed, Russian culture does have an effect on us, and I think that we're seeing just recently an uptick in interest. So young people, at least in this country, probably don't bring quite the baggage that some of the rest of us bring, and they are showing interest. So how do we tap into some of this? Well, to me, education is one way to do it. Student exchanges, study abroad, visiting scholars coming from abroad, great ways for us to really meet face to face. As a librarian, I worked closely with the Russian Federation of Librarians. The director was at my inaugural when I was president of the American Library Association. We really see eye to eye. So how can we build on professional relationships, scholarly relationships that really do put us together eye to eye, and we really do connect? One thing that struck me when I was doing some research is how many public libraries in the United States, not just research libraries like the Library of Congress, who has a Russian scholar at its head, but small public libraries all around the United States are now buying Russian materials because there are Russian speakers, Russian emigres in their communities. And they don't just make those materials available, they have cultural activities around those collections, and they bring much more interest. So it's not just in the academy, but all around the country. There's interest in art, music, literature, sports, hockey, whatever. The Americans have had libraries around Russia for years. Now they're called the American Corners. They used to be the USIA libraries. They are not only a place where Russians find out lots about the U.S., but some of them are the locations for where we have these dialogues. Similar now, we have some comparable kinds of opportunities here in this country, where we do have local communities that may not seem real international, but paying a lot more attention. So I think there's great opportunity in looking toward boundary-spanning institutions like libraries, like museums, and I could go on and on with those, for creating common ground. These are places where people are not only comfortable, but they can meet face-to-face with people who are different from them and learn and find common ground together. So this is a place for civil society, I think, in both Russia and the U.S., and gives us opportunities that we really need to tap into. Are there challenges? Of course there are challenges. Still, I think we're not putting the R word high enough up, perhaps, in our institutions. Moscow State University is trying to create a relationship with my school at Rutgers, and we're having a little bit of trouble finding people interested in having that relationship. Believe me, I will go back and push it. But it seems to me as if there are challenges, but we really need to take advantage of opportunities, look to people like Jim Leach, who leads the National Endowment for the Humanities, as the way to really build those people-to-people relationships that then can also build much more opportunities for dialogue on national and international relations.
Thank you very much, Nancy, and thank you, panel. I want to just try to make a summary thought here. You know, Irina talked about sustained dialogue as a way in which we have found it possible to bring together people deeply, deeply traumatized. What is the foundation of that? That is creating conversations in which people begin to see each other as whole human beings in all their complexity, in which they expose their sufferings and mobilize the natural empathetic elements in every one of us, so that then we begin to recognize that some of ourselves in the other. And this is what I've heard in all of these excellent presentations, that we are beginning to see each other as whole societies, as complex, as troubled, as having hope, and we hope that hope never disappears. Without hope, I agree, it is the devil's work. And there is no, we just don't want to think about not having hope. It is fundamental to everything we do. But let me just, before we open for questions, I want to ask one question each, one question for the panel, and I would like your very brief answer. I was going to ask for two of the things that you find most positive and two of the things you find is the most challenging obstacles, but I'm only going to ask for one. One of the, what from your own presentation, thoughts, and life experience, what is the most hopeful element that you see in terms of a sustainable public support for the relationship? What is the greatest challenge that we have to work on together to sustain that? Anyone who would like to start? You look ready, Jim. Okay, okay.
I want to defer.
Okay. Alexei, go ahead.
Okay,
He's ready.
Okay, I can try. I think I still probably, I may sound very conservative, but I still believe that the most essential thing happened over 20 years is we stopped to fear. Believe me. This is essential thing. I remember the perestroika days and the years before perestroika. I remember that it was frightening when it were darkening in the street, because the radio and TV were broadcasting the nuclear war is about to happen any day, please be ready to mobilize, whatever. New generation, they totally unaware of this possibility to feel like that. It is essential. It's a source of my hope. It was accompanied by many complications. For instance, I say Russia does develop a desire to be positively engaged, but there is lots of painful things relating to the status of her, joining the West. And the very wording, you say join the West. Russia is talking about a partnership with the West. It is different. It is painful. It should be considered and discussed further.
Thank you very much. Jim?
Well, the two most positive aspects are clearly the public respects for each other's public. The second is the trauma facing the United States today relates to one, the anarchy of terror, but secondly, the coordination of economic competition that other people have used rules to their advantage. And intriguingly, we share the anarchy problem, and there is no grave economic competition between Russia and the United States. Now, there is possibly some manipulation and pricing of raw material here or there, but in general, we have a very complementary relationship, and so there is no reason that this should not become a closer and closer relationship, and in such a way that, for instance, it puts a tie together that could have the effect of disadvantaging those who want most to take advantage of both of our societies. Now, the downside is that there is a tendency among those in the political arena to want to emphasize differences. And that tendency has been very large in America for a long time, and luckily is dissipating, but it certainly also exists in Russia.
Thank you very much. Irina?
Well, if we are talking about possibilities, and unfortunately, I come back to the tragedy of 9/11, and I remember the reaction in Russia, in the reaction of Russian society to what had happened to the Americans. Gosh, we are all human beings after all. We are so sorry. It's a terrible tragedy. We must share it somehow. I don't want us to unite only in tragedies. You know, people say that it's more or less easy to share grief. It's much more difficult to share success. Let us share successes of each other. And then, if I can add to it, speaking about obstacles, I would say that unfortunately the competition in certain post-Soviet states is an obstacle to better understanding, because both societies perceive it as a threat to their security. I believe that, again, probably thanks to society, thanks to Dartmouth, we are trying to mitigate the conflicts of the states in most sensible areas and places. Thank you.
Thank you. Nancy?
So I think we have lots to learn from each other, not only in our history, but in our present experience. And there's probably no other two countries in the world that have been where we've been. So learning from each other is something that I think we can really gain a lot from. And our big challenge, though, is it only seems to be in fear and in crisis where we pay attention to things. So can we get Russia back on our radar screen as equal partners in looking at this?
I think this has been a wonderful discussion. I want to hear your questions or your brief comments, which, as in the past, I will also tell you when they become a little too brief. Who would like to be first? Please don't be bashful. We are very, very open. Please. Microphone.
Спасибо за возможность высказаться. Я думаю, что то, что произошло в 90-х, можно назвать, несомненно, позитивным, практически переломным этапом взаимоотношений Америки и России. Но после перестройки и 91-го года была допущена, мне кажется, все-таки трагическая ошибка, связанная с тем, что упоение результатами холодной войны привело к тому, что россияне почувствовали себя брошенными в пропасти проблем, экономической разрухи, катастрофы практически. И вот в этот момент, наверное, был огромный шанс по-настоящему выстроить мост между Россией и Америкой, но он не случился. И сейчас, когда уже обе страны испытывают необходимость перемен и необходимость преодоления глобального экономического кризиса, возникает второй шанс. И этот шанс мы не должны упустить.
Спасибо. Would anyone like to respond or add to that? I think that's, a very powerful comment. We cannot lose this second chance. Please. Thank you for your comment. Please.
Yes, let me follow up on that. 20 years ago, I'm with the Cato Institute. We had a conference at the Academy of Sciences. And it was still Soviet Union then. And one of the Soviet scholars at this conference said, we will now be part of a global civilization. Which meant no more class struggle, no more. We will now be part of a global civilization stretching from New York, London, Paris, Moscow. Didn't happen. 5 years later, I was at another conference in Moscow at the USA Institute. The first question, how do you, at a press conference after the conference, how do you explain the rise of anti-Americanism in Russia, already in 1995? And the Russian respondents gave 5 reasons. I don't remember all 5. But the first one, the West has still not accepted us as a full member in any of its institutions. This was the one civilization. So that follows up. So where do we go from here? Because I keep hearing the West, Russia. The West, Russia.
I'll just make a brief comment and ask my panel. Part of the answer we heard in this comment that we think of partnership, the West says, you may join us. But in concrete terms, we heard from the State Department that we are closer than ever to Russia becoming a full member of the WTO. That is creating trade partnership. Our president has proposed a cooperative anti-ballistic missile defense. That is a partnership. So you're right to point out that we have a long way to go. But what I think the Dartmouth Conference symbolizes is a partnership of private citizens with the confidence of their governments, trying to help address those problems where governments have not been able to realize the potential, to open their eyes, whether it's Georgia, whether it's in Pakistan, or whether it's in Moldavia. So, but my panelists, please.
Well, I think that was very well said. What can't be underemphasized, though, is the mistakes of the prior speaker in the great economic transformation. That the opportunity was sensational, and Russia moved in a direction of concentrating ownership in the hands of a few, and of making it very difficult for decentralized competition to develop. And this proved to be awkward for outsiders wanting to deal with Russia, and it proved awkward for Russians trying to deal with themselves. And so how we manage our way out of this is going to be a challenge, but it's a mutual burden.
I might mention I spent 12 years from 1990 through end of 1991 doing business in Russia and in Eastern Europe. And I certainly found my Russian partners to be wonderful, committed people and excellent business people. But the point, there is no question. I also experienced the collapse of 1998. And there's no question that there were enormous hopes. I remember in the early 90s, my Russian friends saying, finally, we will be accepted. Finally, we will become part of the civilized world and recognized as such, which we deserve given our great history, but we need your help. And the help, which unfortunately was either given or received, it is blamed to go all the way around, that is accepted or offered, was probably, was at best extremely costly. And we can't afford those kind of mistakes again. That's a very powerful question. I thank you very much for it. Yes, please, Scott.
We heard a lot of very thoughtful opinions from both Russians and U.S. citizens about the relationship. And in the United States, we're supposed to be an example of democracy, but I have concerns about that in this media environment and political environment. I have concerns about whether our policymakers will embrace those opinions and whether those opinions will in some way be reflected in future public policy. Mm. And also the question is, will it be embraced in Russia?
Yep. And this comes from an elected mayor, so he knows what he's talking about in terms of how will the public react.
Let me respond briefly to the awkwardness about our democracy today. There is an underpinning of support for broad, progressive policies towards Russia. But the political system is bifurcated. And the political system has elements where it is astonishing the power of a committed few who are concerned about one thing or another, and how they have come to control the political apparatus of the political parties. And this is something that, as a people, we've got to think through. Now, there are some times, frankly, that democracy can have misjudgments in terms of the public, and you might have a leader that's ahead of the game, and there are other times when the public is way ahead of their political leadership. Over the last couple of decades, the public has been ahead, in general, of most political leaders. Now, today, it may or may not be the case, but the political parties no longer reflect the broad spectrum of the American people, and this is an intriguing phenomenon.
Any other comment?
Well, I agree 100% that there are people who are very much criticizing the existing political system, and you can read Russian newspapers, you can read internet, you will find a lot of comments, a lot of proposals to the changes to be introduced in the political system. But the problem is that many people are just struggling for survival. And when you are struggling for survival, you wouldn't care too much about political system, about political institutions, and other ingenious things.
One more question. In the back. Susan.
Thank you. I guess as I've been listening to this discussion, I have gotten the feeling, like one or two people apologize for saying something conservative, or there seem to be sort of swipes at the way the media is going in the United States, or that somehow what's happening politically in the United States doesn't affect the public in many ways. And I guess I'm concerned because I feel that what's happening in the United States in very many cases is a reflection of large parts of the American public, and that the polls and everything else seem to show a great division between elites, whether more Republican or Democratic, and the public. And so my question is there some way, as the Dartmouth process goes forward, to have the people who participate, and they're basically elites in many ways, be somewhat more reflective of the lack of consensus among American elites? And I'm not talking about rich elites. I'm talking about political, economic, social, etc. Because I have the sense that this is more, the coastal elites that are participating, and that there's not if it turns out that the American public and the people that they're electing, and this may happen now next week, are more conservative or more antagonistic, say, to international cooperation or things like that, that these people have to be included in the dialogue because they are part and an important part of American public opinion.
Go ahead, Nancy.
a lot of research is showing that in our country, we're becoming more and more stratified. Even though we're more and more diverse, we're spending our time and hearing only people that agree with us. And I think our electronic communication vehicles actually reinforce that rather than bridge that. So I go back to some things I said about how we really need some bridging cultural institutions that are safe places for people to express themselves without screaming and yelling at each other, where they can really have civil dialogue and start to make choices together. And those choices can be as much in our local communities as they are nationally and internationally. But we've got to really look hard for those opportunities to bring all these different stratified groups together.
If I could just say one quick thing. Definitively, there is a coastal parochialism, and definitively, if you are a citizen anywhere in the country, you have a sense that your elites have let you down. With regard to the Russian-American relationship, and this is just a very small aspect that no one in America thinks much about, or few in America think much about, but our very best in academia, in the economic front, went to Russia and forgot the word equality. And this is an extraordinary phenomenon when you're advising a foreign government. And ironically, we became, at the elitist conceivable level, partly complicitous in one of the greatest inequality sets of decisions ever made by a government at any time. And so there is an aspect of elitism that the best and the brightest can err as well.
I would make a more general comment, Susan, to your excellent question. One reason we began this series of seminars today to celebrate Dartmouth with the results of citizen deliberation is because we at the Kettering Foundation are committed to finding ways in which citizens can have more control over their own lives. And these forums are places where they discuss those. And the thoughts that emerge in those forums help to inform our own thinking about how to approach particular issues. So I would say, while there are always links, maybe tenuous, I think that at least by design there is a very deep connection to citizen thinking. This is why we have held 4 rounds of forums specifically on issues that would help to inform us who participate at the directly in the Dartmouth conference. And more particularly, you'll recall from your own experience during the Reagan era how another principle of our, and this is really at the elite level, that our delegations should include people always who have the trust and confidence of those in power, no matter which party it is. And that means if we have, a Tea Party majority in the Congress, those views will be reflected in the discussions in our, and by people who hold those views in our dialogue. Otherwise, we lose credibility. And we lose ties. But we spend an enormous amount of effort and time to engage the public, sometimes directly, as we did in 1988 in these dialogues, and as we also do in other exercises to bring the results of public deliberations to elites in what we used to call the public voice here in Washington. I want to thank this audience for those very stimulating and troublesome questions, because those are the kind we need. And I want to thank each of our panelists for a superb discussion. Thank you.